Hello, Dan Olaso again with History for Today. And as I'm preparing to update this short handbook and turn it into a full-on explanation on how to take notes and do research and then write papers, I thought that it would probably be a good idea for me to review the notes that I had made myself on Sönke Ahrens' book, How to Take Smart Notes. Because I think this is a book that's very well regarded in the field of personal knowledge management, and it's one that I got quite a bit out of myself. So in this video, I will cover the introduction and the first chapter. And then I'll do a number of additional short videos just to go over my big takeaways from this very important book. So in the introduction, Sönke Ahrens makes the point that writing begins long before the author ever sits down to a blank screen or to an empty page. And he also says that most of the books on the topic tend to forget that fact. He may actually be positioning the competition in a slightly more negative light than it really deserves, but I will grant, and I do agree, that most of the advice that at least undergraduates and wannabe writers tend to get tends to begin with that notion of the panic caused by the blank page. Ahrens says, and I agree, that a set of what he calls smart and interconnected notes is really the solution to this problem. And that has always been my experience. My father's first chapter in his original short handbook, actually, that he wrote for the students at UC Davis, was about reading and taking notes. And we've continued with that focus in the update. And of course, now I'm adding much more note-taking and Zettelkasten kinds of ideas to that in this new version that I'm working on now. I think the bigger insight here, which Ahrens takes directly from Luhmann, I think, is that writing is thinking. And I've said that so many times now that people are probably getting tired of hearing it. But writing is really the medium that we think in, rather than the product of thought that has already happened internally and that only comes out onto the page once it's thoroughly processed into a product that's ready for prime time. I also like the way that Ahrens deflates the idea that writing has to be hard and has to take a lot of discipline. Several people who I've been reading recently, I don't remember all of them at the moment, have testified that it really doesn't take a lot of willpower to do something that you love. And I also like the way that by saying this, Ahrens sort of subtly crushes the idea that good writing is a gift of the muses or an expression of some type of genius talent that other people just don't have. It's really much more about preparation and about practice. So those were my takeaways from the introduction. In the first chapter, the things that really appealed to me were that Ahrens describes how Niklas Luhmann had said that he had apparently never forced himself to do anything that he didn't like, but that he was nonetheless extremely productive. Ahrens says later that Luhmann worked on a number of projects simultaneously and jumped between them as the spirit moved him. I think this is very interesting, and I cover this in my introductory thoughts in the inspiration and interest section. Ahrens also talks about breaking down the process of writing a paper into little tasks that can be repeated regularly and relatively easily. I actually had a similar thought when I first contemplated writing my PhD dissertation. The average page of my writing, I found, had about 2 paragraphs on it. And that meant that a 300-page dissertation or a 300-page book has only about 600 paragraphs or so. And I thought, a paragraph is relatively easy to write. If I did 5 a day, day in and day out, I could complete a couple of books a year. Ahrens does say that a good student or an author interested in a variety of topics needs a system to keep track of what he calls an ever-increasing pool of information, and to allow the researcher to question these ideas, to compare them, and to combine them in new ways to generate new insights. These ideas are not necessarily just data points. Oftentimes, they're interpretations and the beginning of theories. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in my second section on reading notes, about the difference between the types of notes that you take when you are reading, for example, textbooks for data versus monographs for interpretation. Ahrens also claims that the simplicity of the system that Luhmann used, the Zettelkasten or the slipbox, allows for it to get out of the way of the content of the notes. It is designed, Ahrens says, to be the simplest possible way to store atomized points and to retrieve them and to work with them. I wondered, as I was reading, whether there were limitations to this. Are there ideas that are just too complex, that don't lend themselves to this type of atomistic summary? I'm not saying there are. I'm just raising the question, and I still haven't answered that question for myself. Niklas Luhmann apparently had two boxes, one for bibliographical information and summary notes, and one for his own ideas, elaborating on those data points. He tended to write new permanent notes with his existing notes in mind. The point of that was to find at least one point of connection between the new idea and the ideas that were already in the box. This was not necessarily the ultimate or most important connection, but it was a starting point that anchored the new idea into the constellation of knowledge that he was already working with. A truly random piece of data has very little hope of being remembered or being ever revisited. When Luhmann added a new idea, Ahrens said, he considered its context in terms of the ideas that he was already interested in. This was physically manifested, of course, in his numbering system. But again, the initial position and the number seems to have been only a first step, subject to modification. And of course, this argues heavily against the idea of excessive keywording or choosing folders, as we're encouraged to do in several note-taking systems. Those are the ones that I tend to shy away from. I'm going to continue on into the second chapter here, actually. In it, Ahrens says that writing notes is an easy process if you've read and you've understood a text. You prove to yourself, he said, and then later, of course, you prove to others that you've understood the text and what the author said by repeating it in your own words and then commenting on it. And I think this is the basis of my focus on paraphrasing. And actually, I might add that you make sense of what you've heard in a lecture by writing it down. And if what you write down makes sense later to yourself and makes sense to others, then you've understood the point. Ahrens actually then quotes the neuroscientist Neil Levy, who claims that the human mind functions better with and even relies on what he calls external scaffolding. Personal knowledge management isn't really that new of a concept. Ahrens bases his note-taking system on this system developed by Niklas Luhmann in the 1950s, which Luhmann continued to use until his death in 1998. And during his career, of course, Luhmann was able to use this Zettelkasten system of over 90,000 note cards to write over 50 books and over 500 academic articles. There are several levels of note-taking in Ahrens' version of this system. The first, which he calls fleeting notes, are those that you make while reading. Ahrens recommends jotting down notes instead of highlighting. Personally, I think there's probably something to his claim that writing something by hand probably helps to make it more persistent in memory than typing it, and certainly more than simply highlighting it does. On the other hand, I'm not sure that I'm that convinced that it's a game changer that I will stop highlighting, because of course I am going back to my highlights and I am reviewing them and I'm turning them into reading notes and then permanent notes, etc. The second stage, Ahrens says, is the literature notes, which are what I'm calling reading notes. Ahrens says to be very selective and to paraphrase. And he also says to keep a solid bibliographical trail so that you can backtrace the note to its source. Finally, permanent notes, Ahrens says, should be made within a day or two of making the reading notes. And this is where you situate the new idea in the context of existing ideas that are already in the slipbox. In the analog box with the 3x5 note cards, of course, you put the new note right behind the note that it most relates to, and then you add more links if they're called for. If you use indexes, you may want to add the new note to an index card. Ahrens isn't particularly clear about this. Ahrens does say that one of the key features of the slipbox is that it prevents the need for brainstorming. Brainstorming for ideas, he says, can be replaced by looking in the slipbox for chains of notes and clusters of related ideas. You're finding evidence, he says, of your pre-existing interest in the topic and of the connectedness of the ideas, rather than forcing it from the top down. Like Luhmann, who was apparently working on multiple projects always, Ahrens says that we can use the slipbox to work on multiple projects simultaneously, and it can help us find the connections between our interests. He talks about what he calls a critical mass that turns a mere collection of notes into an idea generator. And he's getting that directly from claims that Luhmann has made. But he seems to have had the experience himself. I've had an intuitive sense of this possibility, and it's nice to hear Ahrens reaffirm this, even if he gives no direct evidence to back up that claim. The point of the permanent note, which Ahrens keeps returning to, is that it has been filtered by our interest, which makes it much more likely to be useful to us. Hopefully, this will also result in us being able to make it interesting to others. Well, I've found that very interesting. I'll say more in the next few days about my thoughts on the chapters that follow this in Ahrens' book. But I hope, for the time being, that other people have found this a little bit interesting. So, thanks very much for listening. I'll see you again